You are now tuned into the truth frequency.
We are TFR. TFR.
Truth Frequency Radio.
Sit watching our TVs while some local newscaster tells us that today we had 15 homicides and 63 violent crimes, as if that's the way it's supposed to be. We know things are bad, worse than bad. They're crazy. It's like everything everywhere is going crazy, so we don't go out anymore. We sit in the house, and slowly the world we're living in is getting smaller, and all we say is, please, at least leave us alone in our living rooms. Let me have my toaster and my TV and my steel-belted radios, and I won't say anything. Just leave us alone. Well, I'm not going to leave you alone.
In every revolution, there's one man with a vision.
Captain Kirk, I shall consider it.
I've been a participant in some of the most insidious lies and witnessed to deeds that no crazed man could imagine. I spent years watching you from my lofty position to know that you were the one I could trust.
And why did you lie to me?
There still exist some secrets which should remain secret. Truths that people are just not ready to know.
Who are you to decide that?
The world's reaction to such knowledge would be far too dangerous.
Dangerous? You mean in the sense of outrage? Like the reaction to the Kennedy assassination, or MIAs, or radiation experiments on terminal patients, Watergate, Iran-Contra, Roswell, the Tuskegee experiments. Where will it end?
You want answers? I think I'm entitled. You want answers?
I want the truth!
You can't handle the truth!
Get out!
Or what? You'll kill me?
Always remember, dissension's the greatest form of patriotism.
The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies.
We have before us the opportunity to forge a new world order.
Yes, we can. And you say.
Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories.
A lie's most convincingly hidden between two truths.
Well, I guess it won't end.
No! I don't have time for this. This is about saving the future of humanity.
We know things are bad, worse than bad. We know the air is unfit to breathe and our food is unfit to eat. I don't want you to protest. I don't want you to write to your congressman because I wouldn't know what to tell you to write. I don't know what to do about the depression and the inflation and the crime in the street. All I know is that first, you've got to get mad.
The line must be drawn here. This far, no farther.
I want you to get up right now. Go to your windows, open them, and stick your head out and yell, I'm a human being. My life has value, and I'm not going to take this anymore.
You shall not pass!
You're listening to the Revolutionary Radio Project with your host, Rob Skiba.
Hello and welcome to the Revolutionary Radio Project. I am your host, Rob Skiba, and of course, you know what that means whenever I play that intro. That means the conversation tonight is going to involve, in some way, shape, or form, conspiracy or conspiracies. In fact, this is going to be a very old conspiracy that apparently is still playing to this day. My guest tonight is an author named Gary Wayne. He's written a book called The Genesis 6 Conspiracy: How Secret Societies and the Descendants of the Giants Plan to Enslave Humankind. Gary is a Christian contrarian who has maintained a lifelong love affair with biblical prophecy, history, and mythology. His extensive study has encompassed the Bible and Gnostic scriptures, the Quran, the Bhagavad Gita, Gilgamesh, and other ancient epics, language, etymology, and secret society publications. And I've been hearing a lot about him from various other people who are familiar with my work, especially with regard to what I've done regarding what I call the Genesis 6 experiment. And so I have not yet read his book, but I have heard about him. So I'm really excited to have him on tonight and to dive into his book. So without further delay, Gary, are you there, sir?
I am here, and I am so excited to be here tonight. I think what we're going to talk about tonight is going to intrigue and get the interest and curiosity of your listeners up. I'm hoping we're going to cover material that perhaps they've never heard before and want to maybe have a deeper dive into after the show and maybe into my book.
Yeah, okay. Well, before we get started, where can they find your book?
Well, the first place they can go to find my book, if they want a personalized or autographed copy, you can go to my website, which is www.genesis6conspiracy.com. And on there's a buy from the author button that you can go onto, and you can put whatever detail you would like on for the personal autograph. There's also connections on the website to Amazon.com and Amazon.ca. And of course, the book is available online through Amazon, through all the Amazon sites around the world. There's also off the website a link to Barnes & Noble, and it's also available through Barnes & Noble. And basically any online bookseller around the world will have a listing for it, so they can get it there if they have a preference other than Amazon or Barnes & Noble. And if you have a preference to buy it from your local Christian store, Send the Light Distribution is the distributor for the book, and so if they don't have it on the shelf, they can order it in for you.
Very good. And that's Genesis 6 Conspiracy with the number 6. So Genesis number 6 conspiracy.com. All right. So just for the sake of my listeners as well as myself, because I don't know much about you other than what I've kind of seen floating around a little bit on the internet, why don't you give us a little bit more of your background and tell us a little bit more about yourself, your testimony, and how you got started in this research?
Well, I was baptized United, and I was raised Baptist. And then as I got older and into high school, and further on into life, I had a sort of falling away, brainwashed with the propaganda in schools with evolution and, just the regular sort of independence that teenagers tend to have, that rebellious nature. And somewhere around 1981, I have a brother who gave me a book by Hal Lindsey called The Late Great Planet Earth. Mm-hmm. And he said, and I'm sure most people in the audience are probably familiar with that book, but one of the classics written in the 70s, he said, you need to read this book. And so I read the book, and it just scared the heck out of me. And I wanted to find out whether or not this was actually true. I mean, coming up in Baptist church, there is a little bit of prophecy that's in there in the second coming, but the details that Hal was talking about was things I wanted to verify myself. And as I went through that process, I came back to God and back to Jesus and just absolutely got smitten by the prophecy bug. So what I did was I started to catalog everything in the Bible on every sort of aspect of prophecy so I could have it all cataloged and easily referenced. And as I was going through this research, I came across the interesting giants out of Genesis 6 and saw how the giants kept coming up in the Old Testament, and also how they seem to have a relevance to the end time. And so I thought I would write my first book, which would be my easiest and shortest book, which would be how the giants are connected with prophecy, and particularly end-time prophecy.
Short book.
As it turned out, it's probably going to be the longest book I write, I hope. I've got 12 or 15 I want to do. And this book, just so the audience knows, it's over 800 pages. There's well over 100 pages of footnotes, or endnotes, I should say, because I wanted to bring credibility to this genre. There's so many writers out there, from what I understand and what I hear out there, that they use some basis and then do a lot of speculation. So I wanted the reader to be able to check where I got my information from. And I think the reader will be astounded as to how much annotation there is to support whatever I'm saying. Mm-hmm. So that was my path back to God and Jesus, was actually just being smitten by the prophecy buff and learning the Bible as best as I could, and then wanting to get out and share the message as to what I've learned.
Very good. Yeah, it's one of those subjects you don't hear a lot of pastors talking about in church, especially since seminaries these days are teaching pastors that Genesis 6 is talking about the sons of God as the sons of Seth mating with the daughters of Cain. Have you run into that problem?
Well, that's a very, very popular belief that's out there, and it's certainly the doctrine that's taught by mainstream churches, and even the churches that I'm attending to today, whether or not I attend the Catholic Church with my wife or an evangelical church that we also go to. It's a very, very standard doctrine that these were humans in Genesis 6, if they bring it up at all. And typically they tend to brush over it, because anything that tends to be kind of supernatural other than what Jesus might have done, they tend to really sort of gloss over these days, which is unfortunate. And I think this doctrine sort of set in probably in around the 1500s with the rise of modern science, that it's become a bit, I guess, for some people who are uncomfortable with the concept that anything that's supernatural just is, shouldn't be looked at. And they try and put it onto shelves or lock it away into a vault. I understand the argument, and it's a good argument, except that it doesn't seem to hold water, in my opinion, with what the Bible actually says. And, to confuse Sethites with the sons of God when we can look to the book of Job and it clearly identifies angels as the sons of God, and in a context that would not be human. So if we're looking at these sons of God in Genesis 6 as being human, and they tend to say, well, let's go to the New Testament and let's go to the Pentecost, where Christians are being brought in and grafted into the new covenant in an adoption process as sons of humans, as opposed to sons of any, of God, or sons of angels or anything like that, and to inherit the new covenant along with Israel and Judah. So they're using a New Testament argument that is clearly an allegorical adoption to what's being done in Genesis 6.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, but I mean, Job, chronologically speaking, predates Genesis, and it makes reference of the sons of God in several occasions. One most notably when it's talking about the sons of God being there singing and rejoicing at creation. So clearly that can't be the sons of Seth.
Exactly. And I'll cite all three of those in the Sons of God chapter in the book. But certainly 3 times in Job, the sons of God are noted as angels.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just clicking through your website while we were talking. In your first chapter, chapter 1, Heroes of Old, you actually have a graphic I created right there.
Yes.
That's one that I did. That's pretty cool.
That's the first time I had heard your name. There was a fellow by the name of Troy on Facebook who said, did you get permission on that? I said, not permission, but on the website I have where I've taken the pictures from, I've shown where they were derived. So that's the first time I'd heard your name.
Yeah, no worries, man. This is the kind of stuff that you find these things all over the internet. You just do a Google search on Giants or Nephilim, and you find these kind of stuff. But so let's kind of start with chapter 1 then. Heroes of Old. What's your take on that?
Well, what I start off with is in Genesis 6:1 to, right through the first 4 or 5 verses there. And what I'm talking about in chapter 1 is where it says the offspring were produced were giants or Nephilim, depending on which translation that you're talking about, and that they were men of renown and heroes of old. And so I take that right at the beginning of the book, and I said, what Genesis or Scripture says as a whole continually is using words that are there for a reason and a particular meaning, and nothing is there by chance. And when we look at, and I'll talk about in the first chapter, just to sort of bring this full circle, is that we see superheroes today. They're like demigods, whether or not you're talking about Superman or Spider-Man, but they're these superheroes that are better, stronger, faster, live longer, whatever the personality trait to this particular superhero is it's a reflection back into the times of antiquity. And if we look at what hero defines that, its ancient meaning is demigod, and the offspring of a human and a god. And so if we look at Genesis 6 in that sort of aspect, all of a sudden in the Bible we have this talk about angels, sons of God, mating with human females and producing demigods and giants. And so I'm just introducing the reader in chapter 1 to the idea that there's a lot more going on in prehistory than what people think. And there's a lot more going on in prehistory than just Genesis 6. So my book quickly moves into from identifying that these were the daughters of Cain and the sons of God were fallen angels. And I'll cover that off in the first couple of chapters. But then I'm going to move into what was also going on in the antediluvian world. And if people aren't familiar with the term antediluvian, that just means pre-flood. So if I use that word again, understand I'm talking about before the flood, and if I go post-diluvian, that'll be after the flood. And so if we go back to what happened with Cain and Abel and what happened with Cain, that is sort of core to what's going on with the creation of the giants and the conspiracy that starts in the antediluvian world. And so Cain produces this whole bloodline of descendants, of progeny that's listed also in Genesis. And the first son of Cain is Enoch. Just as there's an Enoch in the Seth line. Well, we move through and the names are quite similar, and we get into an interesting individual by the name of Lamech. And then he's got several sons, one being Tubal-Cain, one being Jubal, and Nama that are listed. And we're not really told a whole bunch about it, but these are very, very, very important figures. And they're talking about some sort of almost mundane sort of sciences, but it's hinting at something that's going on that's significantly more than what first meets the eye. And so what's going on around the giants is what happens before. And so I start to introduce sources from other religions and from secret societies. And people might be surprised to hear that Freemasons and Masons, they take their history back to before the flood. And that their history begins with Cain and Enoch and Lamech and the four siblings, or the four progeny of Lamech, who I named before, Nama, Tubal-Cain, Jubal, and Jubal. So if we look at what Freemasonry and the other religions, particularly the Gnostic religion in this particular case, is the descendants of Cain and the descendants of Seth learned what we call the seven sacred sciences. And the seven sacred sciences is what propelled the antediluvian age to heights that possibly might rival our own technology and maybe even beyond. And that is quite prevalent when you get into all the other different parallel sources to the Bible around the world. Now, just in case there's some people out there that are very, very dogmatic as a Christian, everything that I do in the book, in terms of bringing outside sources, I will weigh against what it says in the Bible. So if there's some Christians wondering whether, how far sort of away from the Bible I'm going to go with it, then they can rest assured that everything that I write about in the book, I measure against what's said in the Bible. And if there's listeners out there that are saying, well, how Christian is this? I'm going to give you so many sources and so much information from places that you've never heard of before that, or never thought that information would be there, that you're going to find that there's a good balance. And I let those other sources speak for themselves. I'm not trying to let them speak for themselves. But they say Freemasonry, and I use a book by Albert Mackey called The History of Freemasonry, where it lists all of these legends out.
Do you find that, because I run into the same problem, because I will quote from Enoch or Usher or Jubilees or the Copper and the Gost or Epic of Gilgamesh or any of these other sources, that some of these people, especially Christians, will go completely ballistic on you because you deviated from the accepted canon.
Yeah, and I think you have to be very, very careful with it. But if you do weigh it against what it says in Scripture, you're all you're doing is providing more context.
Right, exactly. That was my contention. Is like, look, these books are not written in a void, and they say in real estate it's location, location, location. Right, it's the key. But like, you hear so many people, pastors and whatnot, saying that with Scripture it's context, 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 and well. But part of the context is understanding the environment within which the writers lived, and what other. When you read through some of the writings of Solomon, for instance, it is very obvious. I went through the Sumerian epics and was reading all of his creation. Solomon's almost directly quoting from these in a few places. That it was clear these guys understood Isaac cultures.
Absolutely, and people will also be surprised to learn that Solomon, and I believe it's because I let them speak for themselves in the book, and I'll talk a little bit about this, is the other side, and particularly the secret societies, and in this case the Masons as the older society, not necessarily the modern ones, but they do take all of those legends and it's all part of their rituals and everything. They claim Solomon as a grand master of Freemasonry and a sorcerer. Yeah. So I'm going to get into all of that as the book sort of progresses. But getting back to what was going on in prehistory is these seven sacred sciences, they had the power to destroy the world. Mm-hmm. As they took alchemy to a complete new level. And if we look at what came out of these seven sacred sciences, this is what partners with the Nephilim in the sixth generation, or the generation of Jared. Mysticism, Enochian mysticism from the descendants of Cain, is produced through these seven sacred sciences and their development, because they needed to teach the elite. They needed to keep it secret from the rest of the people, and they created a mystical religion and secret societies to develop these religions. And so we have the descendants of Cain, we have dark angels, we have mysticism, and we have secret societies all rising together at the same time to come together to produce the Nephilim kings that usurped the antediluvian world, totally corrupted it away from God and the worship of God, which brought on the flood.
Now, when we're talking about Cain, I know there's two schools of thought. I want to get your take on it. Son of Adam or son of Satan?
Well, scripturally, it says he's the son of Adam, but it's a little bit ambiguous in Genesis. If you look at the word for Cain and brought forth, is it also could be translated as acquired. But I recognize that, but you need to understand that the idea that, and I'm not saying that Cain isn't, but scripturally, we don't have that as absolute solid platform. Where this comes from is the Gnostic religions. Mm-hmm. And the Gnostic religions have several different gospels and scriptures on this. And they firmly believe that Cain was either the offspring of Eve and Satan, or Eve and dark angels that raped Eve, and or the offspring of Lilith and Satan.
I was just going to ask you about the Lilith thing. What's your
Yeah.
take on that?
That Lilith is the father or the mother of Cain, or just Lilith as a whole?
Both, in general.
Okay, well, again, I'm going to go with the scriptural aspect of it. That no, I don't believe that that's the case. Now, Lilith is talked about at great length, and is at some of the significant allegories that I'm going to talk about in the matriarchal line of the dragon bloodline, or the Nephilim bloodline of the descendants of the Nephilim, as is the fairy aspect of the allegory, whereas the dragon aspect is the male aspect of the seraphim angels and the Nephilim. That's the patriarchal line. So what we do know is Lilith is also associated with vampires and bloodsuckers and a whole bunch of other nasty things in the Sumerian prehistory. Yeah. And so I think if we look at what's going on in the antediluvian world, and this is my speculation, but you have a couple of different things going on here. So you have not only the dark angels mating with humans to create a demigod of giants known as Nephilim, but they also had the ability to have in these mystical religions, as they have recorded, a changeling ability and the ability to choose a gender of their choice. And so if you look at that ability to do that, and you look at the lower gods in the pantheon that is in all around the world, there's these lower gods that are above the demigods, which are the giants. So you have this, in this realm, you have the spiritual dark angels mating with spiritual dark angels, creating another type of god, a lower type of god. And I think that's where these other lower gods come from in the pantheon of, around the world. And just so people understand, when I talk about the belief systems, there's not many belief systems. There's monotheism, which Judaism and Christianity, and this might take a few people aback, but essentially Islam is based on. And I don't want to get into the arguments of whether or not that's a false religion, but they talk about it.
Hold that thought.
It's a monotheism. And then
we're going to break, and we'll come back after that.
The Rundown live with Mike and Kristen, Monday through Thursday on Truth Frequency Radio.
And we're back on the Revolutionary Radio Project. I'm your host, Rob Skiba. My guest this evening is Gary Wayne, the author of the Genesis 6 Conspiracy. And we're addressing the antediluvian world before the break, the world before the flood. I got a question for you. I personally do not believe in the serpent seed doctrine that Cain was the offspring of Satan. I've heard the arguments. I'm well aware of them. I believe that he's the actual son of Adam and Eve. However, there can be no question that Cain went down a dark path. Whatever your view is, or whatever anybody else's view is, obviously he went down a dark path. And the Kabra Nagast says that it was they kind of blend the Sethite theory with the angel theory by saying that the sons of God were indeed angels, but they mated with the daughters of Cain. Did you find anything along those lines in your research?
Well, certainly I utilized the Kabra Nagast on that as well. The outside mystical religions that sort of envelop a Christian aspect of it, or polytheism, which is the second belief system, which all goes back to Enochian mysticism before the flood. And it did cross the flood, this whole belief system. The Gnostics talk extensively about that. So, yes, they do believe that the descendants of Cain, only from their perspective, though, is that the descendants of Cain were not evil. They were enlightened, and they were doing good, and they were just freeing humankind of all of the bonds that the God of the Sethites, our God, was what they thought was restricting them from. So they don't believe they were evil.
So you found then, it sounds like, that they sort of followed the Enki route. I mean, when I was reading the Sumerian myths, it seems like Enlil is like sort of their twisted, distorted version of Yahuwah, our God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Enki, they kind of flip everything. It's like they were both sort of instrumental in creation, but Enlil just wanted everybody to, be mindless drones serving him and whatnot. And Enki's like, no, I want them to have wisdom and understanding and et cetera, et cetera. Did you sort of follow down that path, or is that what they're talking about? Where they sort of, it's like Lucifer's the good guy, because clearly in the analogy, Enki's he's Loki in the Norse mythology, or he's Satan in the biblical understanding.
Exactly, and they, in the Sumerian mythology, you have essentially Enki and Enlil as equal, and Enlil was the god that brought on the flood, just so that everybody sort of understands what we're talking about. And above them would be the universal life force.
But Enki, big bad Enlil, he got mad at the noise of the people, so he's going to wipe out the world with a flood. But Enki in the story is the one that warns Utnapishtim, I think it was, or whatever their version of Nimrod.
Ziusudra or Utnapishtim, whichever version you want to go on it. Yep.
Yeah, of Noah, saying, okay, the big baddie's going to wipe out the world, so I'll help you with this ark thing.
So but you see, this started back then, that whole belief system. And this is part of the belief system of the secret societies and religions that are going to be around in the end time, is that they actually believe that Lucifer is the equal of God. That is the propaganda that they've been taught, and that's what they teach all of their people. And they believe they will win the rebellion in the end time. Mm-hmm. They actually believe they can do it. They do not believe our God is all-powerful, omnipresent, omnipotent. They believe he's just another angel, powerful angel, but equal to Lucifer. And that's what they teach. Yeah. And this all begins in the antediluvian world, this whole belief system.
I've seen an interview, you've probably seen it floating around, where there's a high-level Freemason being interviewed on the street, and he's talking about Lucifer the same way we would talk about Jesus. He's like, Lucifer is it. He's the enlightened one. He's the angel of light and blah, blah, blah.
Yes. They believe Lucifer is the angel of light. He's the one who freed humankind from ignorance in the Garden of Eden. And they would call the tree of good and evil the tree of gnosis. And in this cult of knowledge religion that's mysticism, that they believe that the more you learn and the more you're able to discipline that knowledge will help you evolve into becoming a god. And we hear that in the conversation between Satan and Eve, that, if you eat of that tree, you can be like God. And that's where this whole thing comes from. And I'll cover off that in detail in the book.
So does it go further back than the Enki myth, or is that pretty much where we start to see the beginning of that whole idea?
Well, it is constitutive in every religion around the world that's polytheist. It's in every culture. There are these two gods. It is the same pantheon in every religion. They just have different names in all these other religions.
But did you find that the Sumerian is, as the oldest text that we have out there, is that sort of where it originates, or would you say there are texts or support for that idea further back beyond the Sumerians?
Well, the Sumerians are the last recorded prehistory that we have, although I'll cite an instance in the book where they've discovered some texts that are Sumerian that predate the Sumerians of Mesopotamia, and that comes from the Tartarus region. And again, it's all linked with the rise of the Nephilim after the flood and their heritage before the flood. So, but really, if you go back to it, that's the oldest record that we have that I'm aware of. If there is records that are older than that, then I'm not aware of them. But as far as I know, that's the oldest that we have.
There's another argument that I often encounter, and that's where, like King James says giants, the Hebrew is Nephilim in Genesis 6. And some will say that the giants were here first before the sons of God came down because of the way it's rendered in English. I don't personally subscribe to that idea, but what are your thoughts on that?
Well, typically, you've got three different terms being used there. You've got the sons of God, the Ben Ha-Elohim, you've got Nephilim, and you've got Gibberim. Mm-hmm. And that's where kind of the confusion sort of comes in. So what's the difference between Gibberim, which is men of renown and heroes of old and evil potentates? Yeah, well, Nephilim can be Gibberim. So Nephilim can be heroes of old, and they can be evil potentates, and they can be men of renown. And they were the kings both before and after the flood. And they started all the modern kingships and the dynasties. A human can be Gibberim, and he can be all of those things, but he can't be Nephilim. Mm-hmm. And so if you look at the text, it's got the sons of God going to human females, producing Nephilim, who became the men of renown. So if you look at it accurately on how it was originally written and how it's still written today, it tells that in a straight line that all the Gibberim or the heroes of old connotation is giving a description of what they did with their powers. And it's interesting that when you get into the Greek classics, they also talk about the Titans as being heroes of old and men of renown.
Yeah, I saw that Josephus likens the first generation Nephilim to the Titans of Greek mythology. Did you find that there were the Bible as well as multiple ancient cultures seem to describe generations in sort of a succession, like where you'd have you had the Jubilees, for instance, would talk about the great giants, the Nephilim, the Eljo, the Eliud. You have the Sumerians talking about the Anunnaki, the Ogigi, and the Greeks talking about the Titans, Olympians, and demigods. So it seems like there was like this succession of giants that came from the original first generation.
Yeah. So, I mean, if people aren't aware of it, you've got the same story being told all around the world. And whether or not there are 7 different mountains that this was done on, and the Bible is just sort of a Sethian account and the descendants of Seth, we don't know. But what we do know is every culture on every continent, in every religion, in every legend, in every mythology tells the same story, where gods went to female humans and produced demigods. And they're known as Titans or Anunnaki and 1,000 different other names from around the world. The Tuatha De Danann would be another one. And you can go on and on and on. It doesn't matter whether or not it's in India or China or Japan or North America, all have the same story. And it's amazing that they tell exactly the same story, and that these giants, created from either angels or gods, depending on your belief system, caused the flood.
Yeah, it's so. I mean, you have multiple cultures from all around the world, all describing in various different. There some of the details vary, but describing the world being destroyed with water, a number of people and animals being saved, but the flood coming as a result of whatever evil taking place as a result of the gods or the angels or whatnot coming down and having interaction with humans. Your book, we sort of covered the first 4 chapters a little bit here in our conversation. Chapter 5, though, you've got a title here: "The Schism of Antediluvian Freemasonry." What's going on there?
So this information, according to Freemasons and the Gnostics was taught to Adam in Eden, the 7 sacred sciences. And again, this knowledge was taken to a level that could destroy today's world or the antediluvian world. And so when Cain left, we now have 2 different branches that were developing this knowledge from heaven. In combination with the perversion that the descendants of Cain did with this knowledge and the development of mysticism and sun worship and everything that goes along with that, is that there was additional knowledge that was provided to the descendants of Cain from the dark angels and the 7 sages, the 7 leaders of the cult centers of the antediluvian world, according to their belief system, taught them the most. And some of those would be people like Azazel, which most people might be familiar with. They may not be familiar with the other names of the angels, but that would be one that they might be familiar with. And so the Sethians, who were agrarians and vegetarians at that point, they did use astronomy and whatever sciences as active practitioners to develop their own society. But what the Cain descendants did was they took this to a whole different level, and all for the disrespect of the God of the universe.
Yeah. So, I just lost my train of thought. I had this great question I was going to ask, and it just went right out the window. Yeah, I remember. Did you?
So that's I'm sorry. And I didn't finish off, Rob. I guess I should have said. And that's the schism from using this knowledge for the respect of God and honoring God and worshiping God and everything that He's created for us, to the non-worship. And so you have the spurious brand and you have the pure brand of Freemasonry.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, Freemasons like to say they're the pure brand, and they like to mix themselves with biblical patriarchs like Enoch, but they confuse the Enochs. And Tubal-Cain is also a huge patriarch in Freemasonry. In fact, he's declared as an artificer of metals of the highest order. And we want to be careful when we're talking about Enochian Gospels or Scripture. And I know there's references to Enoch in Jude and in the New Testament, and a lot of the church fathers quoted from Enoch. But remember, there's 2 Enochs, so we really have to weigh everything against what is said in the Bible. And so I'm kind of comfortable with the books of Enoch, and the books of Giants of Enoch are from the holy Enoch, the one that walked with God, the descendant of Seth. But Jubilees is a little bit questionable for me, and I know a lot of people like to use them. I did not use Jubilees, not because I think it might be written by the evil Enoch. I just felt I had enough information. But the Essenes, who I'll talk a lot about as we go through this conspiracy, as they come into the scene around the time of Jesus, they believed in Enoch, and they believed in the evil Enoch, and they are also part of the culture and the rituals of modern Freemasonry. But they held Enoch the evil, the Sabaism, the sun worship is their religion, and they held the Book of Jubilees in the highest regard.
Yeah, when I was compiling, I referred to Enoch, Joshua, and Jubilees as a synchronized, biblically endorsed extra-biblical text, only because of the influence that I see in the scriptures that seem to have come from these books. But Jubilees was always sort of a wild card for me, because where I could see Joshua and Enoch, first Enoch, syncing up very well with the Genesis account, there were things in Jubilees that were really questionable to me. And correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding of Jubilees was that it doesn't even really show up until about 200 BC or so. And I haven't been able to verify any pre-existent copies of Enoch or Jubilees prior to what we call the intertestament period, the 400 years before Christ or so. Enoch seems to have a very long history, whether it was in written or oral form. prior to the copies that were found in Cave 4 and some of the other places in the Dead Sea Scrolls and stuff like that. But Jubilees seems to be a much, much, much later writing.
Yeah, it's a little bit murkier. And again, I have no issues in using Jubilees, just that we need to recognize that it's a little bit more doubtful than the other ones. And to me, it's not consistent with Scripture. But again, the Essenes believe that they go back to the great white brotherhood of Heliopolis that came across with Moses and Aaron with the religion that they say, and of course Moses and not Aaron, but Moses would have been indoctrinated and initiated as the son of Pharaoh, adopted son of Pharaoh, as it turns out, in the schooling at Heliopolis. So he would have been initiated into the mysteries, but they pervert that, and so they say their religion is the true religion of Moses that came from Heliopolis, and the book of Jubilees and that information came with Moses to Israel. And so the Essenes believe, as a polytheist religion, that they're the true religion of Judea. And for the people that don't know, just so that you know who we're talking about, there's 3 sects, and all of them had leaders and elders in the Council of Jerusalem at the temple. So you have the Pharisees, you have the Sadducees, and you have the Essenes. Mm-hmm. And the Essenes are distinctly polytheists. And if you want to look at who the Essenes are, they're not talked about a whole bunch of, although Paul will talk a little bit, and Jesus will reference them once or twice, as I recall. But the clearest reference to the Essenes comes in Ezekiel, where these people with white robes come into the temple, and Ezekiel is lambasting them for turning their backs to the temple and praying to the sun in the east and to Tammuz. These are the Essenes, and that's about 700 BC, circa, somewhere in that zone, 600 to 700. And so that's the first time that we see the Essenes, but that just shows you how old that religion was going on. Mm-hmm. And of course, the white robes go back to Heliopolis.
Second and third Enoch seem to be very Gnostic and not anything that we should be paying a whole lot of attention to in terms of its relation to the Bible. It seems to be Gnostic and perhaps even occultic. When you look into the history of second and third Enoch, but they reference Enoch as Metatron. What's your take on that?
Well, Enoch, and I'll talk about this in the book, has so many different names, and he is married into even the Hermes Trismegistus. Mm-hmm. I never can say that properly. Trismegistus. Anyways, 3 times Hermes, and so he's confused with Thoth. He's called Idris. He's called Mercury, and this is a fusing in the Gnostic religion of Enoch, because this Enoch was very, very famous in the antediluvian world, and he's also crosses the flood sort of in spirit through Hermes, who discovers the 7 sacred sciences and partners with Nimrod at Babel. And starts the mystery religions again at Babel with Nimrod. And again, if people aren't aware of it, Nimrod would be the first Grand Master Superintendent of the Freemasons after the flood. And of course, Babel and the city of Babel would be their first act of masonry, as he's reteaching the people the operative aspects of masonry. And masonry is the 5th science of geometry. Also, then the patriarch of geometry in sort of after the flood would be Euclid. And again, all of these things people are going to find are all connected. Everything ties back together.
Do you believe that the Tower of Babel was perhaps built on top of a prior location that may have existed before the flood?
Well, that's a very, very good question, or a very, very good point. So, yes, I do. I do believe it was one of the 7 cult centers of the Sumerian civilization that was rebuilt afterwards. And I'm struggling to remember the name of it. No, I can't come up with it right now, but I do believe it was built. It was a city that was already there, and it was the home of the moon cult in before the flood. And all of this has religious significance with the rebirth of mysticism after the flood. They chose that location for a reason.
Yeah, that's what I was getting at. It seemed very deliberate. I just did a conference up in Oklahoma just recently, and this kind of came up in some of the Q&A. And it seemed to me that after the flood, certainly the Earth was rearranged and looked a bit different, but I think there was enough. Some of the topography must have remained somewhat recognizable. And when they came down from Ararat, it seemed that they made a beeline back to the plains of Shinar, which I believe was pretty much the general vicinity of where they were banished from the garden in the first place. When they were kicked out of the garden, they were into that area.
Well, and Shinar is just a transliteration of Sumer.
Right.
So Nimrod was trying to recreate a civilization that he admired. I know there's a lot of mythology out there that suggests he was a giant. I would say he wasn't a giant. He was Gibberim, as in the example I gave earlier, a human Gibberim, as the original word would annotate him in the Bible. But he was definitely human because his descendancy, his genealogy comes out of the Bible, so we know he's human. Whereas you don't get Nephilim with their genealogy coming out of the Table of Nations anywhere, except for the Horites that are inserted into the chiefs of Edom. So that's and Seir comes out of nowhere. So
I might differ with you on this. The Septuagint translators, the Hebrew scholars that translated the Hebrew text into Greek. Gibborim is one of those words that can be giant, but can also just be a courageous, mighty warrior, like David's mighty men, where it says David's mighty men, the same Hebrew word Gibborim is used. But when it came to Genesis 6, as well as Genesis 10, 8, 9, describing Nimrod, it says that they use the word ton dynaton in the Greek for David's mighty men, whereas with Nimrod, they use the word gigantus. And the Septuagint, actually, Brenton's just comes right out and says that Nimrod became a giant based on the Greek rendering of gigantus.
Yeah, and other sources will say, and even the Freemasons, they write a lot on Nimrod, that even though he was a large man, they say he was not Nephilim and he was not giant. Now, people can argue all day long whether he was or he wasn't, and that comes down to a matter of your belief. I like to side on the fact that I can't name a giant that's labeled in the Table of Nations. And interestingly, after Nimrod, there are no descendants being listed after him. So what that suggests to me, and again, my speculation and going on my hypothesis about giants not being listed in the Table of Nations is that he probably married in with giants and his descendants were hybrids after that. And therefore not listed. But that's my speculation.
You haven't got my book yet, have you?
No.
It's en route. It's in the mail. So I'm still waiting on yours too. It hasn't come in yet. I know we both mailed it to each other. I would say giants are all over the Table of Nations from chapter 10 verses 6 through 20 especially. But that's neither here nor there. The issue I do want to get into as we start sort of transitioning the conversation into the post-flood world is the whole idea of royal bloodlines that become established and whether or not they're still walking the earth to this day.
Well, if we look at the kingships that were established, those were after Nimrod and after Babel, were all usurped once more by the Nephilim, because of their size, and they started dynasties. And these dynasties, whether it's the Mitanni dynasty or if you're talking about the Egyptian dynasty, and so Hermes went from Babel to Egypt with Mizraim, and later, a generation or two later, from the research that I found, the Egyptian dynasty is taken over again by either a son or a grandson of Nimrod.
Hold that thought. Come back after the break and discuss that.
now tuned into the truth frequency.
Your protection from deception. TFR.
Truth Frequency Radio.
Welcome back to the Revolutionary Radio Project. I am your host, Rob Skiba. For the second hour of the broadcast, I'm talking with my guest tonight, Gary Wayne, the author of the Genesis 6 Conspiracy. And right before the break, we were talking about the idea that Nimrod and or his descendants began to usurp the Egyptian dynasty. And I came to very much the same conclusion in my first book, Babylon Rising. So continue where you left off right before we got cut off by the break.
Yeah, and so we have a couple different classifications of these kingships that are usurped. So you've got the pure ennobled lines of the pure Nephilim. Now they do become diluted as there are some human bloodlines mixed in, and you've got the more already diluted brands of the hybrids, I'll call them for lack of a better term. So you've got the pure Mesopotamian line, you've got the pure Egyptian line, you've got the Scythian line that I'll talk about in the book, later in the book, and you've also got what we call the Amalekite pure line, and this will be a little bit confusing for people in the Table of Nations because Amalek is listed. I'll make a case that is a name that the descendant of Esau took from the giants, but the Amalekites were in the research that I found, were another pure bred and were a very ennobled bred. And so you've got three main pillars plus the Scythians that make a four main pillars of the Middle East. And then you've got all of these other giants that are, and these hybrid giants, they are listed in the Table of Nations because the descendants, as my research found, of Noah's son intermarried with these giants. And this is a constitutive belief of the Gnostics as well. And that's sort of where some of the context will come in. And I know at the end of the day, when people when we talk about giants, we like to get into the nuances of it. I guess the big point for me, though, is that whether or not there's a distinction between the hybrids and the purebreds, the point is that giants were after the flood, and they continued.
Yeah.
And these dynasties continued, and they continued to intermarry to keep the bloodlines as pure as possible. And they continue to this day.
That's what I was just going to ask. Have they continued to this day? And that would bring us to, I know we're making a massive jump right now from Tower of Babel to modern day, but maybe this is a good point to do that, at least for this particular aspect of the discussion. When I realized that all of our presidents are related to each other and related to one guy, King John Lackland, the signer of the Magna Carta, who created the Lord Mayor Parade that honors the Nephilim giants of Gog and Magog, it seems to me that this bloodline is still very much at work in positions of leadership around the world.
Yeah, and you're talking about the Plantagenet.
Yes.
And the Plantagenet connects directly back to the Merovingians.
Yes.
And that goes right back to the kingships of King Arthur and the Camelot dynasties. And there's an intersection that the Gnostics will bring in from the alleged descendants of Jesus. And through these dynasties that we're talking about in the last 2,000 years, whether it's the Grail dynasties, the Merovingian dynasties, the Plantagenet, the Stuarts, and these bloodlines continue today, and they truly believe that their bloodlines go back to Nephilim and to fallen angels. And it's why they continue to intermarry today. And I'll make the case in the book, if you want to go from connecting 6,000 years worth of dots in a hurry, is I'll make a case that the Antichrist will come from the bloodlines of the Nephilim.
Yeah, for sure. So, okay, that being the case, then, do our votes actually mean anything at all?
In terms of?
Selecting presidents.
Oh, well,
from Canada, right? So this is, well, I mean, it's the same kind of, do you find the same kind of issues in Canada that we are dealing with in the United States?
Absolutely. The powers of, let me backstep here, because when we talk about all of this, we are talking about the influence of the powerful elite and the secret societies.
Mm-hmm.
And they have control of the parties, and they have control of the governments. I mean, if we can find a way to vote people in who are independent of and not being already corrupted and already being a pawn for these organizations, then it would have an influence. But I guess
that's a pipe dream.
It can really be a pipe dream. I mean, because typically, and in the U.S. in particular, you're going to get two nominees. It doesn't matter. Both of them are going to be illuminated.
Right.
So, and almost everybody running in the race is going to be illuminated. And when I talk illuminate, I'm talking these are adepts. And I know Obama was still rising because he was so young. But he has attained his 33rd degree, which isn't the highest of illumination, but it is adept level in the Scottish Rite. The last picture I saw, I think that was posted, was 32nd degree, but I heard from other sources he's fully illuminated at this point. And so they're going to give you option A or option B, and both is going to go in the same direction. Having said that, I will still vote for the party that's going to at least not persecute me for a while. And I do believe that we're going to be facing a socialist world government who will persecute Christians and are already anti-Christian. So my vote is, okay, I get it that the right still supports corporations, which is like an oligopoly, just with a different name, but at least they protect Christian rights. But at the end of the day, these forces have power. I just think that the left is able to move the agenda more quickly. And it gives us sort of this false sense of comfort that if we put, let's say, a right-wing party in, is that, well, they're going to fix things. Well, it may not move as quickly, but it's not moving the peg back a couple of notches at any point in time.
It seems like when you think of this left-right paradigm, if you've got, if you imagine, like, let's say, a long stick on a board with a peg on the left that says left and a peg on the right that says right, and you, let's say, right wins, well, then it advances that side. Then yes. Left wins, and then it advances the left side. But ultimately, that stick is still moving across the board, achieving the same end goal, if you will, just from different ends of the spectrum. Because, you get the left, it's like, kill all the babies. Okay, fine. They love abortion and all that stuff and, women's rights to kill their babies and stuff. But then you get the right, and they take our babies when they're a little bit older, teenagers, and send them into unjust, unconstitutional wars. So they're still killing our babies. Either way, and this is coming from a guy who's been historically, when I believed in the political system, I was hardcore card-carrying Republican, as far right as you can get. But after when I wrote my book and saw what happened to Ron Paul, I was going, wait a minute, something's clearly wrong with this whole system. And I was a big W fan, huge W supporter, until I started realizing his family history. And going through Skull and Bones and all this, oh my gosh, I was like, I was so disillusioned, and it brought me to tears, quite literally, and had to repent to God, because I'm like, Father, I have this whole idea of, well, I'm going to choose the lesser of two evils. You're still ending up with evil, and especially if they're an illuminated Luciferian at that, and a high level one, in the Bush side of things, man, holy cow. Their history is just unbelievable. But you can tell that these people definitely, when you look into them and their practices and affiliations, that they are definitely part of this dark bloodline.
Absolutely. And that's, what I really enjoyed about, writing my book is in what the reader will find and what people will say about my book on Facebook and when they get a hold of me is I connect more dots than they ever thought possible.
Yeah, so let me just go ahead and stop there and ask you, what would you say, what makes your book unique from other books that are covering similar topics?
Well, what makes it unique is one, all of the information that I'm going to catalog. So they're going to find it's probably, if not, it's one of the top books they've seen in the genre for research. The second thing is I'm going to connect more dots, whether it's political, religious, scientific, you name it. I'm going to connect all these dots, whether or not it's mythology, whether or not it's fairy tales, whether or not it's science fiction. I'm going to connect all the dots. And I'm going to do a 6,000-year connect the dots investigation into how the House of Dragon is going to present the Antichrist in the end time. And what happens as we go through the book is that you are going to get so much information, you need to read it in chunks. So I wrote it in 98 chapters plus a preface and an epilogue, and each chapter will average about 6 or 7 pages because there's about the text, there's say, just under 700 pages of text. So you can read one chapter and then come back. And I methodically lay it out, and each chapter is a story within a story. So it's a mini story, and it leads into the next chapter, and it keeps coming up as the book unfolds. So all of this stuff, they'll see all of these connections coming up, and they'll understand the whole thing as it unravels. And it's going to come at you with information at a pace that most people say, you know what, I can read a lot. I have to do this a couple chapters at a time. And it's going to do that right to the last chapter.
Yeah. When I wrote my first book, I titled the first chapter The Genesis 6 Experiment, and it was the shortest chapter of the book. But just like what you just said, once you go down this rabbit hole, you realize, whoa, this rabbit hole is extremely deep, and it has about 1 billion branches to go off in. And my second book ended up being a 366-page elaboration on the first chapter of the first book. And after I finished the second book, I'm going, holy cow, there's so much more to unpack on this stuff. And it becomes overwhelming, so I can see how easily I kept my books down to about 300 pages because that's all I typically will read myself. If a 700 or 800-page book becomes a quick reference guide when I want to look up a topic. But it's not likely that I'll sit down and read a 700 or 800-page book. But I mean, it's easy for this kind of stuff to blow up into 7, 8, the thousands, of pages once you go down the path.
Yeah, and I took 25% out to get it published. And
so is that book 2?
it could be. And there's so many things I just didn't put in it because at some point you have to say enough's enough. Did I give enough information?
Yeah.
But the unique part of it is I tell the whole narrative right from Genesis 6 right to the end time.
Yeah, very good. That's awesome. So, okay, plowing back through this, we kind of took a little bit of a speed jump from Chapter 8, Royal Bloodlines. Let's look at, let's see here. Lucifer's Revenge. Chapter 13, interesting number to pick for that chapter.
Yeah, it is an interesting number for that chapter. And Lucifer's Revenge, I mean, when we look at what I call the Genesis 6 conspiracy and how it relates to the end time prophecy is we can't ignore what happened in the angelic realm, and we can't ignore the angelic rebellion and the 200 that went to Mount Hermon to mate with humans. And I know that's not in the Bible, that comes from Apocrypha, but they rebelled with Lucifer.
Okay, so you also believe then that the 200 are part of the 1/3?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, they are the ones, at least the ones that were impassioned and were sentenced to the abyss for copulating with human females.
Right, because there's no other way to understand Peter or Jude when they talk about angels that left the first estate and that sinned, that are locked up and bound in chains, because Lucifer and his minions are still out and about doing their thing. But yet we have this group of angels that the canonized texts really you have no frame of reference for. Who are these ones that are bound in chains?
Yes, and these are the spirits that Jesus visits while he's in the grave.
Yes.
For 3 days, who sinned in the time of Noah, and what he's telling them is it's done.
Yeah, I won.
It's over, and I believe that, and I'll make the statement in the book that, and in that chapter that the fallen angels and Lucifer, they didn't anticipate the resurrection, and that's actually comes out of the Quran. Where I got that, but it makes sense to me. But I don't actually believe Lucifer felt he could actually overthrow God. I mean, he would have walked amongst the fiery stones. He knew how powerful God was, but yet he still rebelled. I think he was trying to make a case in his rebellion to live in a separate universe, a separate kingdom alongside, and that God would have mercy over his rebellion and let him do that. I think that's what he was trying to achieve. And so when you look at what happens with Lucifer and with humankind, now they become interconnected. And so we have humans being raised up, that they're actually going to be raised higher than the angelic realm in the future time. And so Lucifer becomes extremely jealous of this, and he's going to bring humankind down. And he's going to try and demonstrate, I think, that humans they're evil, they're going to rebel, and so this is just going to help justify what we did. And I think what he would hope for is God would have enough grace to let them live in another universe or something like that. But we know how the story ends, and certainly with Jesus visiting the spirits while he was in the grave, he told them that. They probably already knew that, and so all they're trying to do after that is deceive as many as possible and bring about the rebellion in the end times. So the first revenge happens in Eden when Lucifer deceives Eve to eat the fruit of the tree of good and evil, and Adam also eats, and so we have the fall. That's revenge number one. The second revenge is that Lucifer convinces the fallen angels, the dark angels, a certain number of them, to go copulate with human females and try and enslave humankind and bring humankind down. And that's the second revenge. And the third revenge, you can say, is probably the end time, but he will deceive as many as possible. So I look at all of this, what humankind is going through, is completely connected to the angelic story. And it all comes to a rendezvous with destiny in the end time.
It's a seed war. It started in Genesis 3.
Yes, and it clearly says, and again, I'm not a fan of the serpent seed through Cain, although I recognize the polytheists and their beliefs in that. But I do recognize the seed of serpent, as it is said to Eve that there will be enmity between the woman and the serpent and their descendants, and I think that was a foreshadow to Genesis 6.
Yeah. Okay, your next chapter following that, it's called The Blackheads. What's that?
So section 2 is all about the global testimony. So what I'm looking to do with the reader is just to repeat sort of over and over and over and over. It doesn't matter which culture, that the flood story and the giant story in prehistory is the same story. And also, what comes along with it in this section is things like the seven sages, and how the Atlantean mythology retells it, and how that's connected to these seven sages and the seven dark angels who led the seven cult centers and the polytheist beliefs. So, when you look at the mythologies from around the world, they're going to look at either 3 or 4 civilizations, but there was actually 7 seraphim angels that had cult centers in the Gnostic belief system. So there could have been as many as 7 civilizations as opposed to 3 or 4 from their belief system. And in the Chinese belief system, that's where the 7 mountains come from. And everything's all about 7 in Taoism and Taoism. So when we talk about these seraphim angels, in case people aren't aware of it, these are the angels that go back and forth, and where the messenger is a very powerful angel. And they were the governors of the earth that was awarded to them in Deuteronomy. They can look that up, Deuteronomy 23. Although let's say the sons of Israel, but then look for the notation at the bottom of the page. Depending on your translation, it'll say sons of God or other gods, but it's getting at the angels. And so these seraphim angels, in case people aren't aware of it, they had, and again, it's very difficult to get this information out of the Bible, but the word seraph actually refers to snakes. And I'll cite those references. It's in Isaiah, and I'll give you the other aspects where seraph comes up in venomous snakes and in Exodus and Numbers. But seraphim angels in the other religions had the face of a viper or a snake, and they had these wings. And so this is where the dragon imagery first comes from.
The reptilians.
The reptilians. Well, let me come back to that in just a second, because that's got a couple other little nuances in what my research found. But if we want to look at from a biblical scripture, look at Satan or Lucifer. And in his seraphic form, which he takes in Eden, he takes the shape of a snake to deceive Eve and then Adam. And in Revelation 12, he's known as the dragon and the great serpent. So that's his seraphic form. And Lucifer is both cherubim and seraphim.
So,
and
wait. But the cherubim, aren't they the bull, the lion, the eagle, and the human face?
Yes. But we have to recognize Lucifer as a cherub because he is called cherub in either, is it Ezekiel or Isaiah?
Ezekiel.
I think it's Ezekiel.
Yeah.
So I think we have to look at him as both, but certainly he's described in prophecy as a dragon and a serpent. And what is also learned from other sources is that the Nephilim looked just like their parents. So they had the face of a viper in their original generations.
Yeah, so we've seen the stone carvings of people that have like the reptilian head. Are these the blackheads you're talking about, or are they something?
No, those are not the blackheads. Those are the Sumerians, actually.
Okay.
And possibly the people of Day 6. That's another rabbit trail, but I'll explain.
Wait.
I'll explain that in the book.
You can't fly by like that, launch a grenade, and just walk off.
And that's the belief system of the Freemasons and the Gnostics, that there's 2 different creations, Day 6 and Adam and Eve as being different.
Right.
Different creation. And I'll talk about that in the book as well. But if you look at the serpent in Eden. Now, this serpent has its legs and its feet taken away, and it was the smartest animal before the fall. And in other sources, some will say it also had wings. So you also have an animal dragon that was a different type of serpent at that time. And there's many different types of serpents, and it was as tall as a horse. So it was bigger than human, almost as smart as human. And it could talk, and we see that in the Adam and Eve account. And it had its arms and legs taken away, and it crawls on the stomach today. But in antiquity, this was a whole different being altogether, and this could be part of the reptilians. And it was the favored being of the seraphim angels.
I got a question on my Facebook page. Someone who's asking Troy. I think you've had some interaction with Troy.
Yes.
He says, please ask Gary. He says, hi Gary, about the Watchers being seraphim class. He said you mentioned it in passing elsewhere, and he'd like to know more.
More about them being seraphim class?
Yeah, were the
Watchers?
Were they of the seraphim class?
Yes. The Watchers is, and in Greek it would be the Grigori, but seraphims were called Watchers. And again, what travels with that name Watcher through all these secret societies and the seven sacred sciences, all of these organizations have names that will translate back as Watcher, and I'll give a number of that as it goes through. But the Watchers were the seraphim angels, absolutely. They were the ones that were in heaven that Enoch goes to visit in the books of Enoch.
Okay, so when people talk about alien abduction type scenarios, you keep having these various descriptions of the Greys, the reptilians, and the insectoids. Sort of these like the three things you hear the most. What are your take on the three, the insectoid so-called aliens and the reptilian aliens and the Greys?
Okay, so if we look at entertainment, just as a quick reference, and let's take Lord of the Rings or any type of mythology that you want, you get all of these little people, right? Yeah. You get these elves, and you get
all kinds of stuff. Yeah, sure.
Okay, so this is the other part of the fairy sort of allegory. So let me just explain this for your listeners. So the Tuatha De Nan are also another part of the fairy allegory, and I talked about the matriarchal being the matriarchal brand, and I'll link that in the book on how that comes together. But understand, in fairy mythology, there are 4 classifications of fairies.
Oh boy, hold that thought. Back.
Radio Ranch with Robert Sales, Monday through Friday on Truth Frequency Radio.
And we're back on the Revolutionary Radio Project. I'm your host, Rob Skiba. For the last half-hour segment of our show, we're talking with Gary Wayne, the author of the Genesis 6 Conspiracy. And right before the break, we were discussing the Blackheads, and we're beginning a discussion on the little people of mythology, the fairies and whatnot. And just real quick before we pick up where we left off before the break, to clarify on the Blackhead issue, is that talking about the color of their hair as opposed to the Nordic blondes and the redhead Canaanite giants type scenario?
Yeah, I think it was a deliberate description, and yes, it does refer to their hair as being black. And if we look at descriptions that we get from the Nephilim coming out of a couple of different aspects, 2 for sure, one being the Atlantean, and the other one being the Tuatha De Nan that resurfaced as the Scythians that I'll talk about in the book. There was 2 distinct hair colors and eye colors. So you have the Nordic sort of ideology one where it's blonde and blue-eyed, and you have the red-haired and green-eyed one that were part of the Celtic Irish descent after the flood. So yes, I think the hair was absolutely a distinction in direct contrast to what the Nephilim looked like, who had also pale white skin.
Mm-hmm. So, of course, I can hear some of my blonde hair, red hair, blue-eyed listeners freaking out right now.
Yes, I have very pale skin myself, so and green eyes, so, and I'm from Irish descent. So,
yeah.
But that doesn't mean I'm condemned. I mean, all
right.
That means, there's probably, and as I believe, and certainly the Bible talks about Nephilim surviving, is this DNA is probably thinned out into so many different branches that many of us probably have some of that DNA or genealogy, but that means nothing.
Right.
I mean, it's what we believe and what we do. So.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because I think some people have this idea that, oh no, if I've got genetic codes in me that was left over in the human race due to the copulation of angels with women, that they're condemned. And I'm like, no. First of all, God's not so concerned about your hair color and your eye color or your skin color. He's concerned about your heart and whether or not you're willing to repent and turn from sin and turn to Him for salvation. And I like it. One of my friends, Daniel Duvall, is another Nephilim researcher, and this conversation comes up a lot with Nephilim researchers. People ask, well, can Nephilim be saved? And his response to it was, I thought it was brilliant. He said, wherever the spirit of man and the heart of repentance is, salvation is possible.
Yeah, I mean, judgment is the domain of God. We ought not to tread on that.
Yeah. Let Him sort all that out. And
yeah.
But, it is an interesting point, because it gets into issues of like Rh-negative blood and things like that, which throws a real monkey wrench into the whole idea of evolution, because you don't find that in the primate kingdom, and yet 15% or so of the human population have Rh-negative blood.
Yes, it doesn't seem to be a natural part of human evolution. It was inserted somewhere, somehow, whether you believe it's Cro-Magnon or fallen angels and Nephilim, or however, it comes out of nowhere.
Yeah.
And it is concentrated.
Yeah, inserted is a really good word. I do believe that's exactly what happened. But this is what I try to tell people. I'm like, look, we have this idea of fallen angels, and we think Hollywood. We think what we've seen in Hollywood for fallen angels, but a fallen angel, if we can use the term genetically speaking, is identical to a good angel. They are called fallen only because they chose to sin. Rebellion is what made them fallen. But they are, genetically speaking, they would look identical to the good angels. So, if in fact there are still genetic remnants passed on through the insertion of their codes, if you will, into the human race, so what?
So what? Exactly. It's just a physical body. It's not your spirit.
Right.
And
I can hear microphone noise there, so I'm not sure what's going on there, but
no problem.
So anyway, yeah, I know we got a little sidetracked on that. I just wanted to clarify that because
So we were going to talk about the fairies, and that's and how that sort of links in with the gray aliens, and I'm not going to link this part into the insectoids, but before I did that, I just wanted to I did Troy a bit of a disservice. So the seraphim is a specific rank. The Watcher and the Grigori are a specific rank, a very powerful rank of the seraphim angels. And there's an interesting thing on the seraphim angels in the Gnostic Gospel, The Origin of the World, and actually describes what they look like. And sort of a quick description on that is they were described as serpents that had long, narrow faces, prominent cheekbones, elongated jawbone, slanted eyes, and thin lips. And so all of a sudden that's going to all start saying, hey, there's, except for size of the Nephilim, if the Nephilim look just like them, there's some interesting correlations to the gray aliens. So let's get into the fairies. So the fairies have 4 classifications. The first one is a spirit, angelic, fallen angel, depending on how you want to define that. It comes from another planet, but they're recognized in fairy mythology as rebelling from God. The second classification are earthborn fairies. So we would know those as Nephilim. The third group is called daemons or demons, and they are a ghost-like spirits. So I look at that as the spirit of the Nephilim whose bodies died out, because their spirit may have been immortal in the first generation, but their physical bodies weren't. And then we have the fourth group that's called the elementals in the fairy mythology. And in the elementals, there are 3 distinct groups, being gnomes, leprechauns, and little people. And in the one group called gnomes, there's also goblins and sprites. This is where the gray alien comes from. And if you go into specifically great Britain into the section of the gnomes and the goblins, there's one specific fairy that's called the Grey Neighbor. And I'll put in my book a fairy abduction. And if you didn't know that that was a fairy abduction, you would think it was an alien abduction. So these are gray, they're small, and they have the exact same description as the gray alien. They have flying machines, they abduct people, they experiment on them, they need an injection of blood to keep their genetics going because of all the interbreeding over the 6,000 years or however long they've been around. And so when I look at gray aliens as part of the alien mythology, and I look at this fairy mythology that has a gray alien and does the same thing as the aliens and has flying machines and has great knowledge and great technology, I'm looking at these are the same story but just told in a way for how advanced their society was. And so for our technically advanced society, these are aliens. And for centuries before our technology, they were fairies, and these fairies come through these portals, also known as shays, Sidhes, or fairy gnomes or fairy mounds or things in the lake. And if you look at the ladies in the lake of the fairies in King Arthur, they are protecting portals to the other world, or Anne Wynne or Tartarus, or how it's all the same sort of allegory. So I think there's a definite connection to this. And if we look at these little people that are talked about in Lord of the Rings, this is about prehistory. And at the end of the trilogy, you see all of these beings going away in a boat on the water, which is an allegory for the flood, because now it's the time of humankind. The other side tells the story and has kept it alive in all of the classics, all of the entertainment, and it goes on today about their history, their genealogy, and their legacy, and it's encoded in all of that. So maybe we should take note of that.
Yeah, for sure. I worked. I'm an artist. I do paintings and sculptures and stuff like that. I got hired by this guy to do pieces for museums and stuff like that. And he was from Norway, and we would have some interesting conversations. And one day, the conversation took an interesting turn regarding gnomes and trolls and things of that nature. And he got real serious. I mean, like the conversation just got real sober real quick. He's like, "Oh wait, we meaning Norwegians, we don't talk about that. That stuff is real, and you don't mess around with it." And I was like, and this was back in the early to mid 90s, before I'd really gotten too deep into this research. But it was really sobering to me because I was like, wow, I mean, this guy's saying this is real. And then years later, I met another friend of mine, Peter, who grew up in Greece and went through the Greek school system and everything like that before he came to the United States. And one day I was talking about the Greek mythology, and he stopped me at one point and he says, "Dude, you keep using the word myth." I said, "Let me tell you something." He said, "We were taught that as history, not mythology." So here's a guy from Greece telling me that this, because we were talking about centaurs and minotaurs and all that kind of stuff. He's like, "No, dude, that's our history. The way you guys talk about Abraham Lincoln and George Washington and stuff, well, we talk about Apollo and the minotaurs and stuff." Well,
and the Jewish people would look at it the same way.
Right.
I mean, the Old Testament is their history. It's not a mythology. It's their history. And so I also think that, we need to look at the days of Noah in the end time as to what happened. And Greek mythology can tell us a lot about possible DNA manipulation.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a warning by Yeshua. He says in Matthew 24:37 that the last days would be like the days of Noah. So, I mean, and what I always say is, look, guys, Noah lived 950 years. We all talk about the flood, but there was a lot of crazy stuff going on in the 600 years before and in the 350 after.
Yeah.
That we may be looking at.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I think the other side has their propaganda out there all the time, and it's in our face, and they're telling us what happened and what will happen.
Yeah.
And they're preparing the masses for what's coming.
There's another character that shows up just as prevalent in my mind anyway as the various incarnations that Nimrod, I think, became known by, and that's this feminine character, this Isis, Ishtar, type of entity. What's your take on Inanna, Ishtar, Isis, and that entity?
Well, in the mystical religion, it's dualist in a couple aspects. One being good versus evil, that they're equal, and that other aspect is male and female. And so, in their pantheon, you have an equal line of male and female deities until it gets right up to the top of the apex. And so if we look at Isis or Gaia or Mother Earth, we're all talking about the same female main deity. And I'll actually take that back to Tiamat and Lilith and connect that back in the book. But this is a constitutive part of polytheism. And so when I talked about other gods being created, by these fallen angels in their belief system, that's how this comes about. And they're going to keep that belief system alive all of the time, because the matriarch is a very, very important part of their belief system. So what do I think? Well, it gets a little bit confusing at times, because if we look at a lot of the giants that came from the other religions, they came from, the female is named as Isis or Gaia or Ishtar, Inanna, so many, they're all the same god. And so, okay, well, that's a little bit different than coming from the daughters of men. So some people might say, well, there's a difference there. Well, you have to remember as well that when we look at other mythologies, whether it's Greek or it's Sumerian as two classic examples, and there are more, they have a couple of distinctions in these Nephilim type characters. And so you have a Titan that's from heaven, and a Titan that is partly of the earth. And so you have to understand that there was two different classifications going on there. So you have gods being born from gods, and then you have giants being born from humans and gods. And so there's two different levels, and that's why we have that hierarchy in the pantheon. But it ultimately all goes up. And if you go into the Sumerian pantheon or the Greek pantheon, I mean, at the top you've got Zeus and Gaia, and you've got Enki and which one did Enki? Was it Inanna?
Mm.
I think so. That's what they're talking about.
Well,
was I clear enough on that, Rob?
Yeah, I think so. In your research, did you find that that she was a pre-flood entity? That's what I found. I found that she was a pre-flood entity.
Yes. Okay. Absolutely a pre-flood, and everything that came after the flood was based on all of the gods and goddesses of the antediluvian world. So Isis and Osiris would have been antediluvian gods, as another example, just as Zeus and Gaia were, right?
So in the Sumerian, I forget which epic it was, talked that Ishtar effectively got in a spaceship. That's what it looks like, to avoid the great flood weapon that was about to come on the earth. So it seemed like she escaped the flood judgment by escaping Earth.
Yeah, and again, you'll look into polytheism, that there are any number of ways that these giants or these gods escape. So most of the legends and the religions, when they talk about gods as opposed to demigods, they went back into space somehow, some way, or another dimension. But if we look at the giants, some of them survived in an ark. Mm. Some of them survived in a cloud. Some of them survived in a prison. And there are even more examples. So they have a number of examples on how they believe that the demigod giants survived the flood.
Yeah. Yeah, and in my second book, I dealt strictly with biblical evidence and Hebraic supporting text. But I had always had in the back of my mind a planned second book that would address the what other religions and other people groups had in mind. Because they're like escaping in the spaceship, or other things. I mean, the biblical example. Okay, you've got so much information to work with, and that's what I did with my book. But I felt like I did want to at least tip my hat to what other cultures were saying, because it seemed there were a number of other ideas. What did you find?
Well, and they also believe there were other types of giants created. So, like the Gnostics believe, Seth was created in a cloud in the space, and then was Lord Earth, and then was protected in a cloud to survive the flood. And if I look at, let me give you one example that I really like to use this one, and the Greek Ark survival is, let me talk about the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, Gilgamesh is also a giant that's mentioned in Enoch, and it knew about the flood, and so now we have this giant in the Sumerian epic that survives the flood, along with Ziusudra or Utnapishtim, depending on which translation that you're using. But Gilgamesh is described as a archetypical giant Nephilim potentate demigod that is violent and a giant and causes havoc and destruction as the antediluvian Nephilim. And he's telling the story to Enkidu, who is described the same way. And he was created after the flood to offset the evil of Gilgamesh, except that they become friends. Mm-hmm. And then they talk about the king of the flood, either Ziusudra, depending on the language. Let's use that name. It's easier to pronounce. And he is the archetypical Nephilim again. So he's not this peace-loving, holy man that Noah is. He's another Nephilim. Mm-hmm. And the family that they take with them is Nephilim. The Epic of Gilgamesh is not the story that Noah was based on. Mm-hmm. Or Noah did not base the story on that. This is, from a Sumerian perspective, a polytheist perspective, is a description of giants surviving the flood in their belief system. And if we go to Deucalion and Pyrrha, or Norea, depending on, again, which translation that you want, and I'll connect Norea back to Nama in my book as a variation of her name, Deucalion was the son of Prometheus. So whether Prometheus was a Titan demigod or a god matters not. We're talking about, that is not the Noah story from the Bible. Mm-hmm. That is a Nephilim survival story. Mm-hmm. And the other cultures are rich with these things, whether or not we believe that or not. But what we do know is somehow the giants were around after the flood.
Yeah, everybody has to deal with that issue. I mean, because people, no matter what theory you come up with for how they returned, there's always going to be somebody that's going to disagree with you. And I say, look, it's not worth fighting about, because the question was, well, if that's what happened, then God failed with the flood. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. Clearly, all of us have to acknowledge that there are giants after the flood and before. So regardless of how it happened, clearly, obviously, God intended, one way or another, for that to be the case. So you can't really use that as an argument. Well, that's stupid, because, why would God do that? Well, either way, you end up with him allowing them to come back, no matter how you look at it.
Yeah, no matter what we do know is there's giants after the flood.
For sure.
And the rest is speculation. And what I try and do in my book is present the options as to how that might happen. Mm-hmm. Try and link that up as best as I can with what it says in Scripture, and then bring in some outside context.
Yeah, right on. Well, we're getting pretty close to the end here. I want to make sure we reference your website and stuff again. So why don't you give everybody your contact information, where they can find your book and more information about you?
Yeah, so I have up on my website all 98 chapters with a generous excerpt from each of those chapters, so you can get a flavor for the book. And that's at www.genesis6conspiracy.com, and the 6 is the number 6. And on there I'll also have a number of my interviews. And you can also buy a book from me, or there's links to Amazon and Barnes & Noble. You can also get a hold of me on the website with an email. Just click on Contact the Author. Also, you can get a hold of me on Facebook. I'm under Gary Wayne, and I also have a couple of Genesis 6 conspiracy pages.
Very cool. Well, the question I'm about to ask you now is probably way bigger than what could be answered in 5 minutes, but maybe this will be a preview teaser for a part 2 interview, which it looks like we're going to have to do, since we're barely through a dozen chapters in your book here. Atlantis. What's your take on Atlantis?
Well, Atlantis is probably the best-telling mythology that parallels the Book of Enoch, and which, of course, parallels Genesis 6. And so what Enoch is talking about, Atlantis is talking about. And what's also interesting about Atlantis is that in the Greek or all polytheist belief systems coming out of this is that there were seven sages that survived Atlantis to go repopulate the earth afterwards. And so it's got some overtones into what happened after the flood as well. Again, is that true or not? Don't know. But what we do know is that this belief system repopulated after the flood. But I have to tell you, the parallels when I walked through Atlantis against what we talk about in the first section of the book, it just nails it perfectly for everybody. This is the same story, just from a polytheist perspective.
Wow. And what was your source material that you were looking at to tell the story of Atlantis?
Well, several, but you have to use Plato, right?
Yeah.
So
that's there.
It starts there, and then you add in whether it's Ignatius Donnelly or there's so many people. And also we'll bring in terms of how Atlantis was destroyed, that it was a number of catastrophic events, including the flood, which Enoch talks about. And then I'll bring back in terms of where that's possible from what the Bible says. And you have to get that from other aspects, but it's interesting that there's some parallels there that again suggest that it's a similar story, just from the polytheist perspective.
You find that a lot, don't you? When you especially start looking through the various mythologies, is everybody's just sort of telling the same story, just putting their own spin on it.
They are, and they tell the same end time story with their own spin on it.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I maybe we can get to that in one of the future shows, because I was doing some research on Ragnarok, and I'm going, wow, this is totally Revelation.
Yeah, it's incredible, and it's why it will come about, because they're trying to bring it about.
Yeah,
it's their plan to bring it about. They would like to bring about the end of time and the rebellion and the Antichrist any time before the ordained time, but they'll take the ordained times if they have to, and they will.
The final showdown, and it's do you think it's like payback, revenge for the flood?
It's partly, yes. It's all wrapped in the rebellion and how disrespected they felt with the creation of Adam.
All right. Well, Gary, thanks so much.
Okay.